Before we begin, how are you holding up tonight? Are you somewhere safe, somewhere warm, somewhere you can trust what you see and hear? If not, you might want to double check the locks. Pull the curtains tight and make sure you are truly alone. Tonight, we dive into 8 chilling tales where a single choice opened doors that were never meant to be touched. Each story reminds us that sometimes the smallest decisions carry the heaviest consequences. So, if you are ready, if you think you can handle the unknown pressing just beyond the veil of night, then let's begin. Sometimes the invitation comes quietly disguised as a small thrill or a chance at something beautiful. Our first story reminds us that not every message deserves an answer, and not every night view is meant to be shared. Story 1. The Last Text from Prospect Hill. Nora Wheeler had always been cautious. She was the kind of person who kept her keys between her fingers when walking alone, who checked the back seat before driving, who avoided dark alleys even in the safety of suburban neighborhoods. But that night, something inside her slipped loose, perhaps from exhaustion or loneliness, or the quiet desire to believe that life could still offer something unexpected. The text came just before midnight from an unknown number, an invitation simple and direct. Come see the lights from Prospect Hill. She hesitated. Of course she did, but the idea of standing above the city alone and seeing it all from above whispered to her in a voice more convincing than logic. She grabbed her coat, slid into her car, and drove without telling anyone where she was going. The streets were nearly empty, the cold pressing against the windshield like a slow tide. Prospect Hill loomed ahead, dark and skeletal against the muted sky. The iron gate hung half open, one hinge, squealing softly as it rocked in the wind. She parked along the curb and stepped out, boots crunching against the frost-slicked gravel. Climbing the path felt surreal, as if she had stepped into the outline of a memory, rather than a place she had not visited since childhood field trips. The city stretched below her, vast and glittering and humming like a living thing. For a moment she forgot about the text, forgot about the strangeness of the hour, forgot about caution. She simply breathed in the view and let herself believe in beauty again. But she was not alone. A figure stood about 20 feet to her left, still as a post, facing the city, wrapped in something long and dark that flapped slightly with each gust. Nora called out a tentative greeting, but the figure did not respond. The air around her tightened, every instinct pulling at her to leave, to retreat, to erase herself from this place. But stubbornness kept her rooted where she was. Maybe it was just another late-night wanderer like herself, someone lost in thought and solitude. She turned back to the lights and pulled her jacket tighter around her. Her phone buzzed again and she glanced down. Another message from the same number. 2 words, this time, look behind. Her heart froze in her chest, blood roaring in her ears. She kept her gaze locked on the city for a long moment before daring to shift her eyes sideways. The figure was closer now, impossibly closer, as if the space between them had folded in half. It still did not move, but she could feel its attention sharp and heavy and cold. She turned to leave, careful not to run. Careful not to break whatever invisible thread held the moment together. Her boots slipped slightly on the frosty path as she made her way down, not daring to look back again. When she reached her car, breath steaming in the frigid air, she locked the doors immediately and sat there with shaking hands on the steering wheel, willing herself to start the engine and drive. The phone buzzed a 3rd time, her skin prickling before she even looked. This time the message said, "Thank you for coming." She dropped the phone onto the passenger seat without reading more, turned the key in the ignition and drove away, without once checking the rearview mirror. At home, the lights felt too bright, the walls too thin. Her small apartment unfamiliar and exposed. She triple-locked the door and pulled the curtains tight. That night, she slept in, fits jerking awake to every creak and sigh of the building. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the silhouette of the figure at the top of the hill. Saw the way it seemed to stretch and breathe and wait. The next morning, she told herself it had been a mistake. A prank. A misunderstanding amplified by exhaustion and fear. She went about her routine, drank her coffee, answered her emails, but the world felt subtly wrong. The angles of rooms, slightly off faces in passing cars, two still shadows that seemed to bend the wrong way. By the third day, she stopped sleeping altogether. When she did drift off, she woke with the taste of earth and iron on her tongue. The buzz of her phone became a constant, always from unknown numbers, always blank screens when she answered. She changed her number, but the calls continued. New numbers, new voices whispering from the static, some pleading, some laughing, some simply breathing. She moved apartments, but the feeling followed the sense of being observed by something standing just out of frame, waiting. She stopped seeing friends, stopped going out after dark. She built her life smaller and smaller layers of locks and routines and prayers whispered in desperation. But nothing worked. She dreamed of the hill almost every night now, of standing on the edge while the city flickered and died below her, of the figure turning at last to face her, and what she saw beneath that shifting cloak of darkness was not a face, but an absence, a hollow, endless, and starving. She woke each time with the sheets tangled and soaked in sweat. One night she woke standing at her window, hand pressed to the glass, staring at the empty street below her mind. Blank. She no longer remembered how she had gotten there. It became clear to her then that whatever she had met on that hill had not stayed there. It had followed, woven itself into the folds of her life so subtly that she could no longer tell where her fear ended and it began. Weeks stretched into months, and still the feeling grew heavier, like a second shadow stitched to her heels. There were no dramatic hauntings, no rattling chains or slammed doors, only the slow suffocation of being watched, being wanted, being slowly hollowed out. Nora stopped answering her phone entirely, stopped checking her email, stopped pretending she could escape it. She spent her days tracing invisible shapes into the walls, her nights counting the seconds between breaths. Sometimes she thought she could still hear the figure calling her from the hill. Sometimes she thought she was already there, still standing in the cold, still looking down at the sea of lights. Some invitations are not meant for you. Some stories begin with a choice you never meant to make and a door you never meant to open. If you ever receive a message on a lonely night promising wonder just a few miles away, remember Nora, and remember how easy it is to step across a threshold without realizing it until you are already too far to turn back. When curiosity breaks past the fence and slips into forgotten places, what you find there may already have been waiting for you. Let us step now into a place where abandoned laughter still echoes through the hollow bones of Glen Echo Park. Story 2. Something Watches from Glen Echo Park. Darren Monroe never thought much about abandoned places. He grew up hearing stories about Glen Echo Park, about the carousel that still spun at night when the wind was right about the empty buildings where laughter once echoed and now only shadows remained. When his friends dared him to sneak inside after dark, it felt like nothing more than another challenge to shrug off. The gate was rusted and sagging, one half torn clean from its hinges, the other hanging drunkenly against the post. Darren vaulted it easily, landing in the cracked asphalt lot with a sharp thud that echoed into the cold night. The moon hung low and sickly, casting long, spindly shadows from the carcasses of old rides and crumbling snack stands. The air smelled of mold and old wood, a stale dampness that clung to his jacket and filled his lungs with every breath. The carousel stood in the center of the park, a gaunt skeleton of what it once was, its chipped horses frozen mid-leap, their painted eyes dulled and blank. Darren raised his phone to snap a picture, but as the flash burst across the gloom, he caught the hint of something moving just beyond the light, a ripple of shadow that slid too smoothly against the stillness of the night. He turned quickly, but there was nothing there, only the peeling facades of the arcade and the silent watching windows of the dance hall. He laughed under his breath and told himself it was nerves, the thrill of trespassing, sharpening every sense to a painful edge. He stepped onto the carousel platform, boots echoing on the warped wood. The horses seemed larger up close, the damage more profound, paint peeling away to reveal bare, splintered bones. The mirrors along the center column were shattered, the shards reflecting warped images of his movements. He circled once, his steps careful, the silence growing heavier with every heartbeat. The air shifted colder, now damp with something deeper than mist. He caught movement again, a flicker at the edge of vision, and when he spun toward it, the carousel groaned beneath him. The horses swayed slightly as if nudged by an invisible hand. Darren backed away, heart pounding, but the platform creaked with every step. The sound magnified into something that did not match his own movements. He stepped off the ride and turned toward the arcade, thinking to get one last picture to prove he had completed the dare. The building yawned open before him, doorless and dark, the inside so black it seemed to swallow the faint light of the moon. As he crossed the threshold, the smell of old electricity and burned wood filled his nose. Broken cabinets lined the walls, their screens shattered, the prizes inside dusty and forgotten. He clicked on his flashlight, the beam cut narrow tunnels through the darkness. The beam caught something on the far wall, a mural faded almost beyond recognition. Children holding balloons, faces blurred and smeared by time and neglect. A scraping sound to his left made him whirl, the flashlight jittering across broken machines. Again, nothing. He moved deeper into the arcade, passing collapsed booths and twisted metal. The floor was sticky underfoot, the air heavier, still pressing against his skin, against his ribs, making every breath an effort. He paused near the back wall, where a row of ticket counters sat abandoned in the prize shelf behind them, a skeletal display of faded stuffed animals and broken toys. The scraping came again, closer now. Not a shuffle, like feet dragging, but a deliberate scratch, like nails against wood. He swept the flashlight toward the sound, but caught only emptiness. Then he heard it, the faint whine of calliope music broken and off. The carousel spinning again, somewhere out there in the dark. Darren backed away, slowly, heart hammering against his ribs, the flashlight shaking in his grip. He moved toward the exit, but the door seemed farther than he remembered. The hallway stretching longer, the shadows thicker, reaching for him with invisible fingers. He broke into a run, feet pounding against the sticky floor, breath burning in his lungs. The music grew louder, the broken notes twisting around him, filling his ears, seeping into his bones. He burst out of the arcade and into the open air. The sky above, wrong somehow, flatter, more oppressive. The carousel spun slowly, the horses bobbing in an uneven rhythm, their broken faces grinning in frozen mockery. Figures stood around the ride, pale and blurred outlines barely visible against the night faces. Unfinished arms, two long bodies flickering like static. Darren froze, caught between the need to run and the certainty that movement would draw their attention. The watchers turned their heads in unison. No eyes to meet his, but he felt their focus lock onto him heavy and absolute. He stumbled backward, turning toward the main path, the gate. His only thought. His flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into a darkness that felt solid, suffocating. He ran, blind hands stretched ahead to keep from crashing headlong into unseen obstacles. The ground shifted beneath him. The asphalt cracked and buckled in the park, rearranging itself in the shadows. He tripped over a low wall and sprawled onto his hands and knees, the skin scraping away from his palms. He pushed up and kept moving, muscles screaming, lungs burning. The gate appeared ahead, skewed and sagging salvation within reach. He threw himself toward it, heart surging with desperate hope. As he crossed the threshold, the music faltered behind him, the heavy silence snapping back like a rubber band. He stumbled onto the street beyond, collapsing onto cracked pavement, gasping for air. He lay there for a long time, staring up at a sky that seemed too still, too empty. When he finally gathered the strength to rise, the park loomed behind him. Silent once more, the carousel still and broken under the weak moonlight. He made his way home every step, heavy, every shadow along the sidewalk, watched with suspicion. That night, he locked every door, drew every curtain, buried himself under blankets, but sleep would not come. When he closed his eyes, he heard the carousel music, faint and broken, whispering through the cracks of his apartment walls. In the corners of mirrors, he saw movement figures flickering just beyond sight. Days blurred into nights, into weeks, into something formless and heavy. Friends called, but he did not answer. He boarded up windows, unplugged phones, disconnected from a world that now felt distant and dangerous. The watchers were patient. They waited at the edges, just beyond the reach of light, whispering his name without breath. Some places notice you when you enter. Some places are hungry. Glen Echo Park had been waiting, and Darren Monroe had answered a call he never should have heard. If you ever find yourself at the edge of a place that hums too loudly in your bones, turn away. Do not look. Do not listen. Some doors, once opened, are never truly closed. Some doors are built to separate what should never meet. Some are left hidden in the most ordinary places, waiting for hands too curious to resist. Follow now as we descend beneath the steady boards of Pier 7. Story 3. The Door Under Pier 7. Stephanie Reed had always loved the water. There was something about the endless roll into the bay that made her feel less trapped by the heavy routines of city life. When the stress from her freelance assignments built too high, she would grab her camera and walk down to the piers. Pier 7 was her favorite, less crowded than the tourist spots, the boards weathered and gray, stretching far enough into the water that it felt like standing at the edge of something forgotten. That afternoon, the fog hung low over San Francisco, curling around the tops of buildings and bleeding into the bay until everything was soft and blurred. Stephanie wandered the pier with no real plan, just shooting what caught her eye. Fishermen hunched over battered buckets. Seagulls shrieking into the mist, the slow churn of the water below. She spotted it near the end of the pier, half hidden by a bench and a pile of old rope, a door set into the boards themselves. It was small and square with rusted hinges and a heavy iron ring bolted to the center. Stephanie crouched down, brushing fog, slicked hair from her face. It looked out of place, too old and heavy to belong to anything the city had built recently. She ran her fingers along the edges, finding the wood soft with rot, the iron cold and strangely dry. Curiosity stirred in her chest, heavy and insistent. She told herself she was just documenting it. That was her job, after all, to notice the things other people missed. She snapped a few photos, the flash slicing through the fog. When she looked up, the world around her seemed quieter. The sounds of the city muffled to almost nothing. Even the gulls had fallen silent. She pulled at the iron ring out of instinct, expecting it to resist or stay locked. But the door swung upward with a low groan that seemed to vibrate through the wood under her feet. A dark shaft yawned beneath, swallowing the gray light. It smelled of brine and something older, something that made the fine hairs along her arms lift. She should have walked away, should have snapped a few more photos and posted them online with a clever caption. But instead, she swung one leg over the threshold, then the other, lowering herself into the darkness. The ladder was metal and corroded, slick with moisture, but it held her weight as she climbed slowly down the door, swinging shut above her with a soft thud that made her flinch. Below was not what she expected. Not a maintenance tunnel or storage space, but a corridor stretching away into the misty gloom. The walls lined with stones so old they seemed half melted. Her footsteps echoed unnaturally too sharp against the dense silence. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, the air thick and metallic. She told herself she would go just a little farther, just enough to satisfy the itch of curiosity that now burned under her skin. As she moved deeper, the light from above faded. Swallowed by the damp and the dark, her phone's flashlight barely cutting through the heavy mist that coiled along the floor. The corridor branched left and right. She chose left without thinking, her movements dream-like. The path sloped downward, the air growing colder with every step, the walls weeping moisture that ran in thin black rivulets down the stone. Ahead she saw a door standing ajar, a thin line of yellow light spilling onto the damp floor. Stephanie hesitated, the sensible part of her brain screaming to turn back, but her body moved forward without consulting her mind. The room beyond was small and round the ceiling, so low she had to duck to enter the walls, lined with old photographs pinned under glass. Faces stared back at her, blurred and warped by time. None she recognized yet, all strangely familiar like reflections seen in a dream. At the center of the room stood a small pedestal, and on it rested another camera, old and battered, a twin of the one hanging from her own neck. A small tag dangled from its strap, stained and faded. It read simply, "Take your place." She backed away slowly, breath hitching the fog, thickening until it pressed against her skin like wet cloth. Behind her, the door creaked and swung wider. She turned to leave, but the corridor no longer stretched behind her. Instead, there was only a narrow stairwell winding downward, the air pulling her with a force that was not quite wind, but felt like breath, cold and steady against her back. She moved because she had no choice, each step downward heavier than the last. At the bottom was another corridor, longer and darker, the mist clinging so tightly to the floor it felt like wading through smoke. Shapes moved within it, low and dragging figures that slipped from view when she tried to focus. The stone walls here were rougher, gouged with deep scars that wept black water. Her breath formed thin clouds in front of her, freezing against her lips. Somewhere ahead, she heard music, faint and tinny, a tune that made her think of broken music boxes and forgotten lullabies. The passage opened into a wide chamber, its roof lost in the swirling mist, a pool of dark water at its center. Something floated within it, a shape human in outline but wrong limbs, too long and boneless head tilting at an impossible angle. Stephanie stumbled back, but the ground under her feet shifted like breathing flesh. She turned to flee, but the corridor was gone, the walls closing in smooth and seamless, trapping her in the circle of stone and fog. The thing in the pool stirred, rising with a slow elegance that made her stomach twist, its movements fluid but disjointed like a puppet tugged by unseen strings. She tried to scream, but the sound died in her throat. The creature moved toward her, not walking but sliding across the surface of the water. Its face a smear of features, eyes weeping, black tears, mouth yawning open in a silent wail. It reached for her with fingers that split and reformed with every breath. Stephanie stumbled back, slipping on the wet stone, her camera tumbling from her hands and shattering against the floor. The flash burst, once freezing the creature mid-motion. Then darkness swallowed the room again. She scrambled to her feet, but the walls pressed closer, the mist thickening into hands that clawed at her jacket, her hair, her skin. Somehow she found the ladder again, or something that felt like it, her hands slipping on the corroded rungs. She climbed blindly the door above, swinging open in a burst of sour air and faint light. She hauled herself through, collapsing onto the boards of Pier 7, gasping and shaking the fog around her clean. Again, the sounds of the city creeping back into her ears like a distant tide. She lay there for a long time, listening to the slow roll of the bay, to the gulls crying over the water. She forced herself to sit up, her fingers bloody and raw, her camera gone, her body aching. When she looked back at the spot where the door had been, there was nothing, only smooth boards, damp with fog. Stephanie Reed never spoke of what happened under Pier 7. Not to her friends, not to herself in the quiet hours of the night, but she never went back to the water's edge, and sometimes in the thickest fog, when the world blurred into gray, she would feel something tugging at the corners of her vision, a cold hand brushing against her skin, a whisper of wet stone and broken music, reminding her that some doors are not meant to be opened, and some curiosities demand a price that is never fully paid. Silence can be comforting, but in some corners of the world it is a warning. Out by the black waters of Coldwater Lake, one man sought solitude and found something else entirely. Story 4. Vanished at Coldwater Cabin. Greg Sutter had always preferred places that other people forgot, tucked away behind crumbling roads and battered trees. The kinds of places where the only sounds came from the earth itself. Coldwater Lake was one of those places hidden deep in Washington's rugged spine, a stretch of water so still and black it seemed to swallow sound and sky alike. When Greg rented the small cabin at the water's edge for a weekend of solo hiking and photography, he did not expect anything more than a quiet escape, the kind where days blurred together under the open sky and nights collapsed into dreamless sleep beside a dying fire. The cabin was smaller than he expected, a squat rectangle of gray wood and rusted tin, leaning slightly to one side, as if tired of standing against the wind. Inside it was bare and cold, the walls stitched with old nails and water stains, a narrow bed huddled in the corner, and a wood stove sulked beside the door. He unpacked quickly, throwing his gear onto the sagging mattress, already feeling the familiar excitement stir in his chest, the hunger for untouched trails and empty miles. The first night passed without incident. Greg cooked a can of stew on the stove, sat on the porch and watched the stars scrape slow paths across the sky. The lake reflected them with eerie precision, so perfectly still that it seemed not to be water at all, but a window into another sky. The woods pressed close and dark around the clearing, breathing out cool, damp air that smelled of pine and earth. When he finally drifted to sleep, the cabin creaking around him like an old ship, he dreamed of deep water and things that moved just out of sight. The second night was different. Greg returned from a long hike around the northern rim of the lake, legs aching pleasantly and memory cards fat with images. He dumped his pack inside and lit the fire, tossing in logs until the room was thick with warmth and smoke. The sky outside bruised purple and black, the lake swallowing the last light like ink spreading over paper. He sat by the fire with the book content until he heard the knock. It was soft, almost apologetic, but loud enough to slice through the crackle of flames. Greg frowned, set the book aside, and listened. Another knock, a little louder this time. He rose and opened the door, stepping onto the porch. No one was there, only the lake stretching silently into the night and the woods breathing mist along the edges of the clearing. He stood for a moment longer, waiting, feeling the weight of the darkness pressing against his skin, then shook his head and retreated inside, chalking it up to wind or animals, or his own tired mind playing tricks. But the knock came again, just after midnight, sharper now insistent. When he opened the door, he saw something, a figure standing at the edge of the trees, too far to see clearly, but unmistakably, there motionless and silent watching. He called out a reflex, more than anything, but received no answer. The figure did not move, did not even seem to breathe. Greg retreated into the cabin, heart thudding dully in his chest. He locked the door, stoked the fire higher, telling himself stories to explain it. Maybe a lost hiker, maybe a local, playing a prank, maybe nothing at all. He slept poorly, every creak of the cabin stretching his nerves tighter, every brush of wind against the walls scraping against his sanity. In the morning, the figure was gone, and Greg found footprints in the mud leading from the tree line to the porch and back again. Single file, perfectly spaced, as if whoever or whatever had stood there all night watching without moving. He told himself he should leave, pack up, and drive back to town, but pride kept him anchored. Pride and a stubborn belief that fear was a thing to be conquered, not obeyed. He spent the day photographing the southern trails, refusing to glance back toward the cabin more than necessary, refusing to let the unease anchor him in place. When he returned at dusk, the footprints were still there, but older now, cracked and dry. He cooked dinner in silence, listening for the knock that did not come. When he finally lay down the fire burning low, he dared to believe the night would pass without incident. The knock came at 3:15, exactly sharp, and measured 5 beats, then silence. He did not move, did not speak, did not open his eyes. The air in the cabin grew heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and cold water, a smell that seemed to rise from the floorboards themselves. He heard the door creak, slow and careful, heard the weight of footsteps crossing the threshold, and still he did not move. Something stood at the foot of his bed, close enough that he could hear the slow rasp of breath, wet and irregular. He lay rigid, heart hammering against his ribs, eyes squeezed shut so tightly that tears leaked from the corners. Time folded in on itself, minutes, stretching into hours or collapsing into seconds, he could not tell. When he finally dared to open his eyes, the cabin was empty again, the fire long dead, the room frigid and dark, the door standing open to the night. He rose and closed it with shaking hands, bolting it twice, dragging the heavy table across for good measure. He did not sleep again. In the morning, he found more footprints, not just leading to the cabin, but circling it, weaving strange patterns in the mud. Symbols he did not recognize, shapes that made his skin crawl to look at for too long. He packed quickly, throwing everything into his car with shaking hands. But when he turned the key in the ignition, the engine only clicked and sputtered the battery dead, despite having been fine the day before. He checked his phone, dead as well, the screen blank and unresponsive. The nearest town was 15 miles away through dense woods with no clear trails. Greg sat behind the wheel for a long time, staring at the cabin, at the lake beyond, at the tree line that seemed closer now than it had the day before. He weighed his options, none of them good, none of them safe. When the sun dipped behind the mountains and the first tendrils of mist began to creep across the clearing, he made his decision. He would walk out, follow the old service road that wound around the lake until it met the highway. Better to move than to wait. Better to act than to freeze in place. He slung his pack over his shoulder and started walking, boots crunching softly against the gravel. The mist swallowing the path ahead in slow, greedy gulps. The trees leaned closer, their branches scratching at the sky like broken fingers. He walked faster, heart hammering breath, coming in ragged gasps. He did not look back. Could not. Something moved in the mist behind him, soft, wet footsteps that matched his own pace, always just behind, never beside. The road stretched longer than it should have, each bend revealing only more mist, more trees, no highway, no lights, no end. The sun set, completely plunging the world into darkness, thick enough to choke on. Greg stumbled forward, blindly following the faint memory of the road beneath his feet. The mist grew heavier, colder until it filled his mouth and nose, smothering every breath. He fell once, twice, scraping knees and palms raw, but he pushed on, driven by the blind animal need to escape to survive. He saw the light just as his legs began to give out, a faint yellow glow flickering through the mist. He staggered toward it, heart soaring, hope flaring so bright it hurt. The light resolved into a cabin squat in gray, leaning slightly to one side, a narrow bed huddled inside a wood stove sulking beside the door. It was his cabin, the same cabin he had fled hours ago, or days ago. He could not tell anymore. He collapsed onto the porch, crawling to the door, pounding weakly against it, but no one answered. He was alone, utterly and completely. The mist pressing closer, breathing against his skin, whispering through the cracks in the wood. When they found the cabin weeks later, it was empty. Greg Sutter's belongings were neatly packed. Inside the fire, long cold, the lake perfectly still. The only sign of him a set of footprints leading down to the water's edge, stopping abruptly at the shoreline, as if he had stepped into the lake and vanished without a ripple. Some places do not want you to leave. Some places remember every footprint, every breath, and when you come too close, when you listen too long to the wrong silence, they do not let you go. Coldwater Lake still sleeps under the mountains, its surface mirror smooth its edges, mist shrouded, waiting for the next heartbeat. Bold or foolish enough to walk alone into its arms. Objects left behind do not always sleep quietly. Sometimes they carry more than memories. Sometimes they carry the echo of a fate still reaching out. Listen closely now to the footage found near the dying shores of the Salton Sea. Story 5. Found footage at the Salton Sea. Mia Torres had heard the stories about Salton Sea. Stories of abandoned towns and poisoned water of communities left to rot under a heavy sky where the wind never seemed to blow clean. It was the kind of place that seemed to hum with the memory of things better forgotten. The kind of place that drew the curious like flies to something sweet and spoiled. She was a film student, a storyteller by ambition and necessity, always searching for the overlooked and the eerie. When she proposed a documentary about forgotten places in California, her professor smiled too easily, as if he knew what kind of hunger she was feeding Mia, set out on a gray morning camera equipment packed neatly into the back of her battered car. Heart beating too fast against her ribs, half with excitement and half with something she refused to name. The road into Bombay Beach was cracked and crumbling, lined with the sun-bleached skeletons of trailers and shacks. Everything bathed in a colorless dust that seemed to cling to her skin. The air smelled of salt and decay, thick enough to taste. She parked near the remnants of what might once have been a diner, though now it was little more than a sagging frame decorated with graffiti and broken dreams. Mia slung her camera over her shoulder and started walking, boots crunching against ground so dry it cracked like paper. She spent hours filming the detritus of lives abandoned the empty playgrounds with rusted swings, swaying gently, the peeling murals, the forgotten signs advertising cold beer and fresh fish that no longer existed. The sun dipped lower, dragging long shadows across the flat land, turning the world gold, and then bruised purple. She was about to pack up when she saw it tucked behind a half-collapsed house, almost hidden under a tarp, heavy with dust. A camcorder, old and battered, the kind used before digital wiped tape into memory. It looked untouched by time, too pristine, its lens intact, the battery compartment closed. Mia hesitated only a moment before reaching for it, her fingers brushing against plastic gone slightly tacky with heat. She turned it over in her hands, feeling a strange pull deep in her gut. Something like recognition, though she'd never seen it before. The tape was still inside. She carried it back to her car with more care than she had shown her own equipment, setting it gently on the passenger seat like a sleeping child. She told herself she would watch the footage back at her apartment, safe among the clutter of books and second-hand furniture. But curiosity gnawed at her, hollow and sharp. The motel she checked into was nearly empty, the neon sign buzzing weakly against the rising night. Her room smelled of bleach and old cigarette smoke, but the bed was clean enough, and the television worked. She set the camcorder on the scratch table, plugged it into the outlet, and pressed play. The screen flickered to life, the date stamp flashing erratically in the corner, unreadable. The footage showed a group of teenagers laughing and shoving each other as they wandered through the same ruin she had filmed hours earlier. Their faces were pale and grainy and distinct, but there was a strange familiarity to them that made her stomach twist. The camera panned clumsily across the cracked streets and dead trees, the low murmur of conversation undercut by the endless buzz of unseen insects. The footage jumped, glitching briefly before settling again. The teenager stood before a building Mia had not seen, its facade crumbling, but its door oddly intact, painted a deep red that had resisted the bleaching sun. They dared each other to go inside the audio, warping and popping as if struggling to contain their voices. One by one, they slipped through the doorway, their laughter dying as they crossed the threshold. The footage grew darker, grainier. The camera's light clicked on, illuminating a narrow hallway lined with doors that hung askew or swung gently on broken hinges. The air through the speakers grew thicker, the sound muffled as if wrapped in cotton. One of the teenagers pointed to a door at the far end, perfectly straight, perfectly still. They approached it together, the camera wobbling with each step. As they reached for the handle, the footage glitched again, the image twisted into static before snapping back. The hallway was empty. The doors hung silent and still. The laughter was gone. Only the hollow buzz of the dead air remained. The camera moved forward slowly, now cautious, the light trembling in the heavy dark. It panned across the ruined rooms, the cracked walls, the piles of debris. There was no sign of the teenagers, no footprints in the dust, no echo of their voices, only silence. Mia leaned closer, breath fogging the screen. The footage grew stranger, more fractured. Images flashed by too fast to process, glimpses of twisted figures lurking just beyond the reach of the camera's light faces, pressed to cracked windows, hands scrabbling against rotted wood. The tape jittered and jumped, the audio degenerating into a low droning hum that set her teeth on edge. The final scene froze for a moment on the image of the red door, now standing alone in an empty field under a dead gray sky. Then, the screen went black. The camcorder whined softly, tape spinning to its end. Mia sat frozen heart hammering against her ribs, skin crawling with the knowledge that something was terribly, deeply wrong. She rewound the tape and played it again, scanning frame by frame, searching for clues, for mistakes, for any explanation. In one frame, she found it. Her own face reflected in the broken glass of a window the teenagers had passed, staring back at her with wide, frightened eyes. She stumbled back from the table, the chair toppling behind her heart and her throat. That was impossible. She had not been there. She had only arrived today. The camcorder clicked softly, the tape ejecting itself. She approached slowly, hands trembling, and lifted the tape free. There was something etched into the plastic with a jagged hand. "Find us." The words dug into the casing like a wound. Mia dropped the tape, backing away until her calves hit the bed. The motel room felt too small now, the walls bending inward, the air heavy with salt and decay. She needed to leave. She grabbed her camera gear, stuffing it haphazardly into her bags, and fled into the night. The sky above the Salton Sea was a smear of stars drowned in haze, the land stretching flat and endless around her. She drove without thinking, hands white, knuckled on the wheel, the camcorder rattling in the passenger seat with every pothole. The road seemed to stretch longer than it should have, every mile marker a grim echo of the last. The headlights barely pierced the heavy dark pressing against the windows. She glanced at the camcorder and found the screen glowing faintly, images flickering across it too fast to catch. Faces stared out at her mouths, open in silent screams, hands pressed to unseen barriers. She tore her eyes back to the road, heart slamming against her ribs. The engine sputtered once, twice, then died. The car coasting to a shuddering stop in the middle of nowhere. Mia sat frozen, the only sound her own ragged breathing and the low whine of the camcorder. The screen flared brighter, illuminating the car's interior with a sickly light. The door locks clicked open one by one. She fumbled for the keys, trying to restart the engine, but the ignition clicked uselessly. Something moved at the edges of the headlights, figures forming from the mist, stepping into the broken light. She saw their faces, the teenagers from the tape, pale and wrong, their eyes empty, their mouths stretched into silent shapes of pleading and rage. Mia threw open the door and ran the salt air burning her lungs, the cracked earth cutting into her feet. The figures followed silent and relentless, the land around her flattening into a featureless expanse of dust and broken dreams. No matter how far she ran, the figure stayed the same distance behind, neither gaining nor falling back. Ahead, she saw the red door standing alone in the endless night. It pulsed with a faint inner light, a heartbeat in the dark. She had no choice. She ran toward it, every instinct screaming, every fiber of her being recoiling, but she ran. As she reached it, the door swung open, revealing only blackness beyond. She hesitated for a fraction of a heartbeat, then stepped through. The night swallowed her whole. The door swung shut, the figures faded, the dust settled. The Salton Sea stretched out under the broken stars, silent and still. Somewhere deep within its bones, another story waited. Another face staring back from broken glass. Another voice whispering from forgotten tape. Some things are left behind for a reason. Some doors should never be opened. Some echoes never die. Anger blinds more easily than fear. It drives us into places we would never enter if our hearts were still calm. Come with us into the gnarled rows of an abandoned orchard where something long forgotten still stands and waits. Story 6. The Man. Standing in the orchard, Luke Freeman had never been the type to run from a fight. He had the kind of stubbornness that got mistaken for bravery, the kind of pride that kept him from backing down, even when backing down was the smartest thing he could do. When the argument with his parents hit its peak and he stormed out of the house, he walked fast and without direction, fists stuffed deep into the pockets of his jacket, head down against the cold breath of the Sebastopol evening. The apple orchard spread out around the town like a fading quilt. The trees bent and gnarled the fruit, long since picked only a few bruised apples rotting in the grass underfoot. The sun had set, and the sky had turned that peculiar shade of deep blue that belongs only to places where the air smells like earth and smoke. And something older still, Luke did not think about where he was going, only that he wanted to be somewhere else, somewhere wide and empty, where the walls could not press against him and the voices could not follow. The orchard had been abandoned for years. Everyone said so. The Hartwell family had closed it down after the accident. No one really talked about what happened, not anymore, but everyone knew to give the place a wide berth. After dark, Luke had never been one to believe in town gossip. He had better things to worry about than old stories. He hopped the sagging fence without thinking, boots landing with a soft thud in the damp grass. The rows of trees stretched out before him, straight lines vanishing into the dark, their branches skeletal against the bruised sky. He walked without a flashlight, without a plan, just letting the orchard swallow him whole. The quiet out there was thick and heavy, broken only by the crunch of his steps, and the occasional sigh of the wind, stirring the brittle leaves. He walked for a long time, letting the cold gnaw at the edges of his anger, letting the endless sameness of the trees strip away the words he had shouted, and the ones he had not. Somewhere deep in the orchard, he realized he could no longer see the glow of the town behind him, could no longer hear the faint hum of passing cars. The world had narrowed to the soft rasp of wind through branches and the whisper of his own breath. He stopped under a particularly twisted tree, its trunk split and blackened from an old lightning strike, the bark peeling away in long strips like dead skin. He leaned against it, head tipped back, staring up at the empty sky, the cold sinking deeper into his bones. That was when he saw him. At first, it was just a shape, a darker shadow among shadows standing perfectly still between two rows of trees. Luke squinted hard, giving a single hard thud against his ribs. He told himself it was nothing. A trick of the light, the way the mind plays games when the world is reduced to shades of gray and black. He turned away, rubbed his hands together for warmth. When he looked back, the figure was closer, maybe 10 yards away, now still perfectly still. No light caught on its surface, no details resolved from the gloom, just the heavy certainty of being watched. Luke felt a prickling along his spine, a slow crawl of cold sweat. He told himself again that it was nothing, that he was tired and upset and seeing things that were not there. He pushed away from the tree and started walking back the way he thought he had come, forcing himself not to look back, forcing himself to listen only to the crunch of his own footsteps. The trees pressed closer as he walked, their branches tangling overhead like grasping hands. The air grew colder, the mist rising from the damp ground to swirl around his knees. He glanced over his shoulder despite himself. The figure was there, closer now, maybe 5 yards, still unmoving, but somehow more solid, more real. Luke walked faster, heart thudding, breath fog in the air in short, sharp bursts. He stumbled over a root, caught himself, and kept moving the orderly rows of the orchard, dissolving into a twisting maze of trees and shadows. He no longer knew which way led out, which way led deeper. He only knew he had to keep moving. The mist thickened, muting the world to a pale smudge. Luke could barely see the trees. now could barely see his own feet. He ran crashing through the undergrowth branches, tearing at his jacket and skin. He thought he heard footsteps behind him, heavy and deliberate. But when he risked another glance back, there was nothing but the mist and the trees and the endless cold. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs shook until he tripped again and stayed down, gasping for breath. The ground cold and wet against his hands. When he pushed himself up, he found he had reached a clearing, a circle of bare ground where nothing grew. The mist pooled thickly here, swirling in slow, heavy currents. And at the center of the clearing stood the man. Closer. Now close enough to see that he was wrong. Somehow, his proportions stretched and twisted his arms too long. His head cocked at a sharp, unnatural angle, his face obscured by the hanging mist. Luke froze, every instinct screaming at him to move to run, but his body refused, locked in place by a terror so old and deep it felt carved into his bones. The man raised one hand, the fingers too many, too long, beckoning once, a slow, deliberate curl. Luke stumbled back a step, then another, his foot catching on a stone. He fell hard, the impact jarring the breath from his lungs. When he looked up, the man was closer still, no longer standing but gliding across the ground without sound or effort, the mist parting around him like smoke. Luke scrambled to his feet and ran blind and panicked, not caring which way he went, only that it was away. The trees closed in again, branches clawing at him, the ground rising and falling beneath his feet like the breathing of some great slumbering beast. He did not dare look back, not even when he heard the heavy, wet sound of footsteps just behind him. The orchard stretched on forever, the trees twisting into grotesque shapes, the mist swallowing all sense of direction or distance. Luke's strength faltered his body, slowing against his will, the cold gnawing deep into his muscles, his mind fraying at the edges. He burst through another row of trees and saw a light ahead, faint and flickering. He ran toward it with everything he had left, the light resolving into a farmhouse, dark and leaning its windows empty and gaping the porch, sagging under the weight of years. He did not stop to wonder why a house would stand in the middle of the orchard, did not question the wrongness of it. He only knew he had to reach it. He staggered onto the porch, hammered at the door with frozen fists, the wood shuddering under the blows, but refusing to open. The light inside flickered once, twice, then died, plunging the world into darkness. Behind him, the heavy tread of footsteps mounted the stairs. Luke threw himself against the door, battered at it with his shoulder, but it held firm. When he turned to face whatever was coming, he saw nothing, only mist and the faint impression of movement. A hand closed around his wrist, cold and unyielding, pulling him back toward the stairs. He fought, kicking and twisting, but the grip was inexorable, dragging him down into the mist. The world tilted, spinning sickeningly, and then there was only cold and silence and the slow, steady breathing of the orchard. When the search party found his car abandoned at the side of the road, they assumed he had gone into the orchard and gotten lost. They combed the trees for days, calling his name until their voices cracked, but they found nothing. No tracks, no sign he had ever been there. The Freeman family moved away a year later, unable to bear the empty chair at the dinner table, the unopened letters the birthdays spent staring at the phone. The orchard still stands on the edge of town, its trees twisted and black, its ground thick with mist, even on the brightest days. People still whisper about the man who watches from between the rows, standing motionless as the sun sets, waiting for someone foolish enough to walk alone among the dead trees. Some places do not forgive intrusion, some silences are not empty, and some things once seen will not let you leave. Some histories lie so deep in the ground that digging them up costs more than we can imagine. Follow the footsteps into the ghost town of Bodie, where doors long sealed should have remained untouched. Story 7. Buried beneath the ghost town. Taylor Banks had never been the kind of journalist to chase the easy stories. She liked the ones buried under layers of dust and silence, the ones that clawed at the edges of towns no one visited anymore. When her editor suggested a piece on Bodie, the famous ghost town tucked into the hills of Eastern California, she jumped at the chance. It sounded perfect history and mystery, a neat package to fill a few pages and maybe win back the attention she had been losing. The drive out was long and dusty, the highway giving way to a rutted dirt road that rattled the frame of her old car until she worried it might fall apart before she arrived. The landscape grew more barren the farther she went, the trees thinning into scrub, the earth baking under a sun that felt ancient and indifferent. When she arrived, Bodie was exactly what she expected, and yet not at all. It sprawled across the hills like a carcass, weathered buildings leaning against the wind, windows staring blankly out over the cracked earth signs warning visitors not to take anything. Not even a stone, lest they invite the curse that supposedly followed those who disrespected the dead. Taylor was not superstitious. She believed in facts, in records and archives, and the testimony of the living. She set up camp just outside the town limits, a small tent and a few essentials. The ranger had told her no one stayed overnight anymore, not after what happened last summer. A story muttered under breath and cut short when she pressed for details. The first day was uneventful. Taylor wandered through the town, taking photos, making notes. The old church with its crooked steeple, the schoolhouse where broken desks gathered dust, the general store still stocked with glass bottles, cloudy with age. She felt the town breathing around her, a slow, shallow inhale that tugged at her senses, but she ignored it, chalked it up to imagination, a side effect of too many ghost stories and too much caffeine. As the sun dipped low, she returned to her tent, cooked a simple meal over a sputtering flame, and fell asleep under a sky so dense with stars it felt almost suffocating. The second day, she decided to explore the outskirts, the places tourists rarely bothered to go. She found the old graveyard, first perched on a hill overlooking the town. The markers there were worn and cracked, names blurred into illegibility, the ground uneven as if it had been stirred by restless hands. She took pictures carefully, feeling a prickle of unease she refused to acknowledge. From the corner of her eye, she thought she saw movement among the stones, but every time she turned, there was only the dry whisper of the wind and the endless emptiness stretching out around her. In the afternoon, she found the church basement, a small door half buried by sand and debris. It stuck when she pulled at it, groaning on rusted hinges, but finally swung open to reveal a narrow staircase plunging into darkness. She hesitated only a moment before descending her flashlight, cutting a narrow beam through the stale air. The basement was cramped and cold, the walls of packed earth crumbling in places, old wooden beams sagging under the weight of forgotten years. In the far corner, she found something that should not have been there. It was a door, newer than the rest of the structure. Heavy wood reinforced with iron bands, a thick padlock rusted shut. The door looked wrong, like it did not belong, like it had been grafted onto the world rather than built. Taylor knelt to examine it, running her fingers over the iron, the wood cold beneath her touch, despite the heat above. She felt a hum deep in her chest, low and persistent, a vibration that set her teeth on edge. She told herself it was nothing, just the thrill of discovery. She took a few photos and climbed back into the daylight. That night, the dreams began. She saw the door in her sleep standing alone in a field of dead grass under a sickle moon. She heard knocking from the other side, slow and deliberate. She woke, gasping heart, pounding the tent walls, pressing close the night outside, too silent, too still. She told herself it was just the isolation, the stress of the assignment. But when she looked at her camera, the pictures she had taken of the basement were gone, replaced by images. She did not remember taking close-ups of the door, of the lock, of the cracked earth around it. In some, the door was open, just a crack, blackness seeping out like smoke. Taylor packed up her gear and headed back to the basement before the sun was fully up. She needed to see it again, needed to prove to herself that she was still in control. The town was different in the early light, the buildings looming like skeletal sentinels, the streets too empty, the silence too thick. She moved quickly, almost running, not caring how loud her footsteps echoed off the broken walls. She descended into the basement and found the door just as she left it closed, the padlock intact, the hum stronger now, vibrating up through the soles of her boots. She should have left it alone, should have walked away and never looked back, but the pull was too strong. She picked up a rock and hammered at the lock, the sound impossibly loud in the confined space. After a few blows, it shattered rust and metal, falling away like dust. The door swung inward on unseen hinges, revealing only darkness. A darkness that felt thick and alive, pressing against the threshold like a living thing. She lifted her flashlight, but the beam seemed to vanish into the gloom, swallowed whole without illuminating anything. Something moved within the dark, a shifting stirring like the breath of some great unseen creature. Taylor stumbled back, but the door slammed shut with a sound like the end of the world. She scrambled up the stairs, heart-pounding, lungs burning. She burst into the sunlight and ran without looking back. Ran until the town was a smear of broken wood and dust behind her. She drove for hours without stopping, without thinking, not daring to breathe, until the ghost town was far behind her. When she finally stopped at a gas station on the edge of nowhere, she checked her camera again. The memory card was full of images. She had not taken faces she did not recognize. Pale and hollow-eyed, staring at her from the darkness, the background always the same, the cracked door standing open behind them. She tried to erase the images, but they reappeared each time she looked away, multiplying, crowding out everything else. She abandoned the camera in a trash can and drove home in silence, the road stretching endlessly under the dying sun. But the dreams followed the door, appearing behind her eyelids each time she blinked, the knocking growing louder, more insistent. She moved apartments, changed her name, tried to forget. But the door found her each time closer and closer. Taylor Banks was last seen leaving her building late one night. Her car still parked outside her apartment, unlocked, her belongings untouched. The only clue was a series of photographs pinned to her walls, each one showing the same image. A door standing alone in a field of dead grass, the door slightly open, darkness spilling out like smoke. No one knows what she found beneath body. No one knows what followed her out of that basement. But some say if you drive past the ghost town late at night, you could see a figure standing among the ruins, watching, waiting the broken door yawning open behind them. Some places do not forget. Some secrets do not stay buried, and some doors once opened will never close again. Sometimes warnings are not meant to frighten us. Sometimes they are the only barrier between us and something that cannot be undone. Listen carefully as we wade into the mist and stillness of Black Pond. Story 8. They told her not to swim at Black Pond. Cassidy Boone had always hated being told what to do. It was a stubbornness born not of rebellion but of certainty. She believed in her own instincts more than the warnings of others. especially when those warnings came wrapped in superstition and whispered half-truths. When the locals in Black Hollow warned her and her friends to stay away from Black Pond after dark, she had laughed. She had heard all the stories about cursed waters and missing hikers, about lights flickering over the surface and voices calling from the mist. But stories were just that, stories, and Cassidy had no patience for fear built on nothing more than old memories and rural gossip. The pond sat on the edge of town, a wide stagnant mirror surrounded by crooked trees and thick tangles of undergrowth. In daylight it looked almost beautiful, the surface smooth and still, the trees bending low as if whispering to their reflections. But as the sun sank and the mist began to creep across the water, it took on a different character, the kind that prickled at the back of the neck, the kind that made silence feel like something heavy pressing against the ribs. Cassidy and her friends had come prepared with beer and a Bluetooth speaker and enough bravado to drown out the warnings that still hung like smoke in their minds. The night was warm and sticky, the air clinging to their skin, the fireflies blinking weakly in the undergrowth. The pond lay ahead of them shrouded in mist, the water a sheet of darkness that refused to reflect the stars. They joked and shoved each other and dared Cassidy to be the first to swim. She stripped down to her swimsuit without hesitation, grinning wide and defiant, and waded into the pond, the water cold enough to shock the breath from her lungs, thicker somehow than it should have been. Not the loose fluidity of lake water, but something denser, more resistant. She struck out into the pond, each stroke pulling her deeper into the mist, the shore quickly vanishing behind her, the laughter of her friends growing muffled and distant. The water lapped against her skin, leaving behind a tingling numbness, as if it did not just touch, but seeped into her. She treaded water and turned slowly, trying to find the lights of the shore. But the mist had closed around her, heavy and impenetrable, muting sound and swallowing sight. For a moment she floated there alone, in a world reduced to gray and black, the air thick with moisture and the faint scent of something rotten. Then she heard it soft. At first, a low hum rising from the depths below. Not a mechanical sound, but something older, a vibration that resonated in her bones. She kicked toward what she thought was the shore, panic beginning to gnaw at the edges of her bravado. But the water fought her, dragging at her limbs with invisible hands. Shapes moved in the mist, flickering just at the edges of vision, too fast to see clearly, too slow to ignore. The water grew colder the deeper she went, the numbness spreading up her legs and into her chest, her heart laboring against the weight of it. She gasped for air, but the mist choked her, thick and wet, filling her mouth and nose with the taste of earth and decay. She tried to scream, but the sound died in her throat. She could feel something rising from the depths below, something vast and slow and patient. The hum growing louder, vibrating through the water, through her flesh, through her mind. She kicked harder, desperate now, but the pond refused to let her go. The surface seemed to stretch farther away with every stroke, the mist thickening into walls around her. Her friends called out from the shore, their voices warped and distant, barely more than echoes. She could see their lights bobbing at the edge of the mist, tiny and weak like fireflies trapped in amber. She screamed their names, but the mist swallowed her voice, turned it into a thin wail that faded almost before it left her lips. She swam harder, ignoring the burning in her lungs, the heaviness in her limbs, the creeping cold that gnawed at her spine. She could see the shore now dim and flickering, but between her and safety rose a figure tall and black against the mist, featureless and still blocking her path. She veered to the side, but another figure rose, then another until they ringed her. Silent and motionless, their presence pressing against her mind like a weight. She stopped treading water in the center of their circle. The pond beneath her, boiling with unseen currents. The figures began to move, not walking but gliding over the surface, their outlines shimmering and shifting. Sometimes human, sometimes not. The mist clung to them like second skin, hiding their faces, their hands, their intent. They closed in slowly, deliberately, the hum rising to a fever pitch, drowning out her thoughts, her fear, everything but the pounding of her heart. Cassidy dove desperate to escape, plunging into the blackness below, the cold snapping at her like teeth. She kicked and pulled, blind and frantic, but the water thickened around her, turning to sludge, to tar, to something that clung and pulled and dragged. Her lungs screamed for air. Her vision narrowed to pinpoints of light. The figures above growing smaller and smaller as the darkness swallowed her. Her hand brushed something solid, rough, and splintered. She grabbed it without thinking, hauling herself toward it. It was a dock, old and half submerged, the wood slick with moss and rot. She pulled herself onto it, coughing and gagging, the mist swirling thick around her, the figure still waiting at the edges. She crawled forward, dragging herself toward the faint lights of the shore. The dock groaned under her weight, the boards bending and cracking, but she moved forward inch by inch. Every breath, a battle, every heartbeat, a thunderclap in the suffocating silence. She reached the end of the dock and tumbled onto the muddy shore. The mist parted slightly, revealing the firelight of her friend's camp. She stumbled into the clearing, soaked and shaking, her friends rushing toward her, their faces pale and blurred, their voices sharp with fear and relief. They pulled her to the fire, wrapped her in blankets, pressed bottles of water into her hands. But the warmth did not reach her. The cold was too deep, too rooted. She tried to tell them about the figures, about the hum, about the way the pond had fought her, but the words tangled in her mouth came out thin and broken. They nodded and patted her shoulders and told her she was safe, now that it was just the mist, just her imagination, but she knew better. In the days that followed, Cassidy changed. She grew quieter, more withdrawn, the light in her eyes dimming to something hollow. She stopped swimming, stopped laughing, stopped sleeping through the night. Her dreams filled with the hum, with the figures rising from the mist, with hands pulling her back into the blackness. Her friends noticed but said nothing, afraid maybe, or unwilling to face the possibility that the stories were true, that the warnings were not just old fears clinging to new ears. They avoided the pond after that night, skirted its edges on the way to town, crossed themselves unconsciously when the mist rolled in. Too thick, Cassidy lasted 3 months before she disappeared, her bed empty. Her car still parked outside her phone, buzzing endlessly on the nightstand. The only clue was a trail of wet footprints leading out the front door and down toward the woods toward the pond. They searched for her for days, combing the woods and dragging the water, but they found nothing. No sign of struggle, no clothing left behind. Only the pond silent and still, its surface undisturbed, its mist curling lazily over the water like a hand beckoning for more. The locals shook their heads and whispered among themselves, not with surprise but with weary resignation. Another name to add to the list, another warning unheeded, another echo swallowed by the black waters of the pond. Some say that on misty nights you can see her standing at the edge of the pond, barefoot and shivering, her eyes hollow, her mouth open in a silent scream. Others say she swims just below the surface, waiting for the next curious soul to ignore the warnings to step into the water to be claimed. Some places do not forget, some waters do not forgive, and some warnings are not meant to scare you, but to save you. If you ever find yourself at the edge of Black Pond and the mist curls thick around your ankles and the water calls to you with a voice you almost recognize, remember Cassidy Boone and turn back before it is too late. Thank you for staying with me through the shadows and silence. Every story we shared tonight came from a place where choices turned into chains, where curiosity became a call. No one should have answered. These stories are more than fiction. They are reminders, whispers, from the forgotten places, warnings stitched into the dark. As you move back into the rhythm of your life, maybe you will pause before stepping into the mist, before answering that strange knock, before trusting the quiet too easily. Not all dangers come with loud warnings. Some wait in the softest places, in the forgotten corners, in the seemingly harmless decisions. If tonight's story stirred something deep inside you, if you felt even for a moment that chill run along your spine, know that you are not alone. We all carry doors we wish we had never opened. Thank you for sharing your time with me. Stay safe, stay aware, and if you ever find yourself standing at the edge of a choice that feels just a little too heavy, remember these stories. Until we meet again, take care and do not stray too far into the unknown.